I was delighted and relieved. This extended my stay there until August. Upon entering the program, we received a security briefing telling us how critically important it was that we keep the information we were about to learn to ourselves. Like so much in the military, there's always an effort to instill a sense of esprit de corps and, of course, acceptance of authority, something I never felt comfortable with. The real job of a CT was to locate Russian submarines. We couldn't actually read the information and had to pass it along to a different group at the National Security Agency. The training school for all this was much easier than the code taking. During this period, I joined the drill team, partly because I wanted to avoid other more menial duties. It turned out to be a very enjoyable and memorable experience. I got to march in several parades. I surprised even myself by learning some rather intricate drills. One time, though, I nicked a fellow in front of me in the elbow with the end of my bayonet. Wasn't serious, more embarrassing than anything else. During one parade, we were marching forward and pivoting left. We had our rifles down, horizontal with the ground, bayonets on. I remember that as we marched into the turn, a little girl at the front of the crowd began to cry. She was frightened at the line of bayonets advancing toward her. After graduating from that school, I was assigned to Winter Harbor, Maine for a year. I put in for that base because it was the closest to home, and I'd probably be able to get home occasionally. For the first several weeks at Winter Harbor, before being assigned to a slot at the work site, I had to work in the cafeteria. It was hard, dirty work with long hours. But after having worked at Northeast Towel for a summer, there was little physical work that I couldn't endure, at least for a time. An incident that occurred after I began my regular job still sticks in my mind. While standing in the line at the cafeteria, a tall, rather lanky fellow suddenly dropped to the floor and started jerking around. The cook on duty jumped to his assistance and called for a spoon to keep him from choking. One of the assistants handed him a rectangular spatula. The cook threw the thing across the hall and yelled for a regular spoon. Eventually, the guy either recovered or the medics came. Can't remember which. Turned out he had a grand mal seizure. Several weeks later, the cook received an award for his actions. Eventually, I was assigned to one of 4 sections. We had the day mid-eve. That's the rotation. Day watch, mid-watch, eve watch. Parts of 6 days on, 3 off. I managed to get home about once a month. It was about a 6 or 7 hour drive home. Sometimes I would drive to Bangor to reach the highway, and then I would drive to Augusta before I picked it up. A couple of times I drove Route 1 along the Maine coast, a beautiful but slow drive, more exciting drive during the winter. On one of the trips back to the base, I fell asleep at the wheel momentarily, but I woke up and I saw an oncoming car. I was on the wrong side of the road. I started slapping myself on the face and stopped at the first restaurant I could find to get some coffee. On another occasion, I was driving home during a snowstorm, trying to be careful, but as I turned a corner, a large snowdrift appeared before me, arranged across the road. Reflexively, I decided to crash through it. The impact blinded me in a cloud of white powder, but I did make it through without any incident. Another time I was driving a Ford Falcon home when the car stalled. Called my father and he diagnosed a clogged fuel filter. He advised that I poke a hole through the filter with a pen or a pencil, which I did. It worked and I made it home. Well, no problem. Driving through Maine was always a picturesque experience. I took some great pictures during that year. The main part of the base itself was about 8 miles from the operations site. Just a few yards from the entrance to the base was a scenic lookout of the park. I loved walking there and taking pictures. I'll always remember that fondly. Because the site was so distant, a military school bus had to be used to shuttle the personnel to and from the facilities. Bus drivers were drawn from the people in the watch. I got a license for driving the bus and was put right into the rotation. I took the course and obtained a license to operate a large school bus. I enjoyed the new duty. On one of my many trips to the site, an approaching car came zooming around the corner and came close to hitting the bus. A few days later, a memo was circulated from the captain of the base announcing that bus drivers should drive more carefully. To this day, I swear that it was his driving more than mine that was the problem. Nothing came of this, however. Another time, the guys dragged a telephone pole onto the bus so the watch coming off duty would have to take it out. A weird sense of humor, but harmless fun. One incident that occurred while I was there told you how pretty that whole area was, Arcadia National Park. I was walking along the waterfront on the rocks in front of the base where the administrative offices were and where we had our barracks, which again was some miles away from the ops center. But I was out there looking around and just enjoying being out on the rocks and seeing the waves. At one point, I saw, was pretty close to the water's edge on a rock, one of the big boulders, and I noticed this wave coming toward me that seemed to be higher than I was standing. So, and as it got closer, I saw that I was really going to be in trouble if that wave reached me. So I turned around, took off as fast as I could, climbing the rocks to get away. And I just made it. Essentially got my feet wet, but I lost my glasses, which I never got back. But it just goes to show you how you really have to be careful. It's that like every so often you get a wave that's higher than other waves. And if you're in a situation like that, walking along close to the water's edge, you really have to be careful. Another thing that happened there that I remember well, and it's the only time really that I saw the aurora borealis from in front of the base. It was beautiful. I mean, the greens and the blues, and that's always stuck in my memory. When I didn't go home for the break, I would often take a trip to the town of Bar Harbor and Ellsworth across the water from where the base was. Though Bar Harbor was only a few miles from the base over the water, it was close to an hour's drive by car. I often made the trip with friends to enjoy what Bar Harbor had to offer. Mostly we'd make the trip to the heart of Arcadia National Park to hike and take more pictures. We also go to the restaurants to catch a movie in Ellsworth. I did make friends there, but no close ones. One of the activities that took up a good deal of spare time was playing board games. There were several of us nerds that what we call them now, would play strategy game Risk. I wasn't much of a card player, especially if money was involved. Another satisfying activity was reading, which I did voraciously. During the year I was there, I took a couple of correspondence courses in Middle Eastern history as well. My section leader was impressed with my academic background and interest and asked me to write a section news to be submitted to our base newsletter. As amateurish as my scribblings were, I enjoyed writing. It helped me get to know the folks that I worked with. When it came for reassignment, I was very anxious. The next post would not be choice. I could spend the next year on a small atoll of Adak, part of the Aleutians in Alaska, or a year and a half on Guam. I got Guam. I was happy at having dodged the Adak bullet. There was something romantic about posting on a tropical island in the South Pacific. My father had been on a destroyer that took part in the shelling of that very island during World War II. The irony was obvious. It was a very long flight with a single touchdown in Honolulu. Looking out the window as I arrived on Guam, I saw this very small island, a place where I was to spend the next year and a half. After the landing, I felt like I was being hit by a warm, wet face cloth. For the first few weeks on the island, I had to nurse a cold. The island was quite an experience, especially in the beginning. One of the unwelcome surprises involved the lovely beaches. As scenic as they were to look at, sneakers were required for anyone wanting to swim. The coral was so sharp and ubiquitous. Also, we were constantly warned to watch for sharks. I even did some snorkeling there. One moment stands out in particular. I was swimming around, snorkeling. It was very pretty. And I came to a point, water drops down to where you can't see anything. It's totally black. And if you know anything about geography around that area, Guam is very close to the Marianas Trench, which is some 7 miles deep, the deepest part in any ocean. So, I mean, I didn't go out over that area. I just turned around and swam around in the more shallow areas. But even there, though the fish were pretty, I had a little bit of an encounter with one of them. I must have been in the fish's territory because though the fish wasn't large, it suddenly turned around and came at me like it was going to take my head off. So we were face mask to face of the fish. I'm the one that decided to turn and go somewhere else. On the other hand, the expansive views of the horizon and sunsets were absolutely gorgeous. Swimming was more like taking a warm bath. I had always liked to float in the water wherever I went swimming, and it was even easier in the saline environment surrounding the island. The thought that the sharks might be moving around beneath me disturbed the serenity of the moments I spent floating. Watching thunderstorms move over the water as they danced across the horizon or headed toward the island was a moving experience. It was so lovely. Getting wet was no problem. The rain was warm and the clothes and skin dried quickly, even in the humidity. My social life was pretty much as it had been at Bar Harbor. I would hang around with friends, but I spent even more time alone reading or just wandering around. Agana was the capital of the island and was the population center, but it can't be called a city in the mainland sense. There was some entertainment in the form of hotels that served mostly Japanese tourists and honeymooners. The Daiichi Hotel was close to the base and was fairly new. I went there occasionally by myself or with friends to take in the entertainment. One time there was a Japanese TV advertising shoot on the hotel beach. There was some very lovely Japanese actresses involved. A friend, Peter, and I managed to get them to pose for pictures with us. They provided for some worksite conversational material. Since there was so little to do on the island, I found some other activities to keep me busy. For almost a year, I did volunteer work with Project Head Start. I really enjoyed the time I spent at the school, learning much about the social life of the islanders. Invitations were extended to me through several fiestas and one event that occurred at the governor's home himself. I was recognized for my volunteer work by the island's governor. Chicken dishes were the island's specialty. Not surprising in view of the number of chickens that roamed around freely on the streets and in the yards. The kids in the program were fascinating. I think I worked well with the kids. I did begin to wonder, though, when the boys began to hit and even punch me. The mainland teacher, a woman who was not that much older than me, explained that many, if not most, of the children attending Head Start didn't know their fathers and were being raised by their mothers or in extended families. Lacking a male presence in their life, they didn't know how to act appropriately with a male authority figure. This was the way they manifested that confusion. The girls were not nearly so demonstrative. They were very often shy and reserved, but they could be stubborn. I learned more from the children than they did from me. For a time, I worked as a busboy at a restaurant in Agana, the Wonder View. It had a wonderful view of Agana Bay. The job lasted several months. I was amazed at how much the Japanese smoked. After every meal, I would have to remove ashtrays heaped with burned-out cigarette butts. This was before the cultural change and saw smoking become much diminished in our own country. The base on Guam was located in the northwestern part of the island. Andersen Air Force Base was to the east and the north. And at the time I was there, Andersen Air Force Base was the base from which all those B-52s that were bombing Vietnam were based. And they would take off from the northern part of the island, which was much higher in elevation from the sea. It was a cliff, so the B-52s would go over the edge and sometimes go down before they took off to rise because they were so heavily laden with bombs. And a couple of times I drove by Anderson from the southern end of the air base, and when they were coming in, it was the noise from those jets coming in was almost unbelievable. The communications base where I was stationed was not a large base. It was small and fairly intimate in the sense that it was not sprawling. There was another naval base with another airfield located close to the middle of the island, not too far away from the main city of Agana, Guam. While I was there, I did enjoy going around the island and taking pictures. Most of the time, when I did those kinds of exploratory walks into the jungle area, I would take a friend, and particularly somebody who was also interested in photography, and we would wander around. One time, we got into a situation where we were going through the jungle, and we got into an area where there were some bees, and it got very, very hazardous, and we had to try to move out of that area, pushing the bamboo away and trying to get out as quickly as we could. So those are the kinds of things that happens when you are exploring in a jungle area. You never quite know what you're going to see over the next few feet. Sometimes, obviously, being a tropical island, there was a lot of water around, and streams and pools, and it was interesting and fun. As long as you had somebody with you. I wouldn't want to be out there by myself. I did not do that. The people that I worked with in my section, I took some trips with, particularly one where we rode horses, and that was an experience because I was walking behind one horse before we started, and it reared back with one of its legs and kicked right past me. If it had hit me in the head, we would have at least a concussion, if not even more serious than that. But anyway, when I finally did get on the horse to ride it, we rode and we actually galloped in places. By the time my ride was over, my rear end was not feeling very well. It was like the back was kind of bony of the horse. The horse was not like a big and robust. It was an experience that I didn't have a lot of fun doing. It was interesting and something that I definitely wanted to try, but I don't think I would have gone out and done that on a regular basis. While Guam didn't lend itself to wide-ranging horse riding adventures. We also played baseball occasionally. While I was on Guam, I actually got a off-base living approval, and myself and another fellow in my section at work rented an apartment not too far from Agana. It was a nice apartment. It wasn't really big, but it was not too far away from the base, and we actually got a car. Living in the apartment gave us a little bit more sense of being off duty when we were not working, not always surrounded by everything having to do with the military. So that part of it was enjoyable. I liked the freedom that was allowed us by owning a car and renting an apartment to get around the island. We went to the different towns on the island. Again, it was only about 32 miles from north to south and about, I think, 7 miles east to west. So there weren't too many places that you could go, and it was really not possible to get lost. Living on the island, sometimes it seemed as though it was a giant military base with pockets of civilians here and there located in towns. But I mean, really, it's a territory, and the Guamanians were jealous of their sovereignty and were suspicious of people in the military because they knew that people were only serving a certain length of time. And as long as they understood that, they weren't making exactly lifetime commitments. This was obviously made it very difficult to, in a way of social life, because most of the girls on the island were either wanted to get married to a military person and get off the island eventually, or they did not associate too much with military personnel. I took and made the effort to do Head Start, spent some time doing some volunteer work. I worked at the restaurant and took opportunities to get around the island. But I did do a lot of reading. The time I spent on the island went by fairly quickly. It wasn't like I felt that I would never get off the island, because a year and a half seems like a long time. But as long as you're keeping busy doing things and you're satisfied with your job, it was easy to find things to do. You had enough off time so you could enjoy doing different hobbies, play games again, like we did in Winter Harbor, Risk. It wasn't much of it. I wasn't a drinker at all. Occasionally I would go like to the Daiichi and maybe have a drink or something, but that was about it. I went to a couple of native Guamanian fiestas, especially when I was connected with Head Start, and enjoyed seeing the difference between the Guamanian people and what I was used to coming from the Northeast, living in the Northeast in the metropolitan area. Agana and all the other towns around the island were small towns, really, comparatively speaking. While on Guam, I could have taken a trip to Hong Kong or Japan. As tempting as that was, I was more interested in buying a stereo and camera equipment and saving money for a new car when I was discharged. I did buy a jade ring and an earring set and a lovely set of Japanese Noritake china for my mother. She had the china displayed in a hutch. She sold it for far less than it was worth. I was very hurt by that. When I mentioned that to her, she countered that we had gotten rid of a bedroom set they bought for us when we were married. I said that we'd had it for almost 25 years and got rid of it because it was coming apart. My mother said nothing. At one point, I was approached by a Japanese fellow on the beach. We started talking, and he introduced me to his newlywed nephew and daughter-in-law. Apparently, there was a common practice in Japan to take a relative on a honeymoon. He invited me to go on a fishing trip with them, and I accepted. While out on the trip, all three of us guys got seasick. The bride was very solicitous toward the uncle. That was the only time I went boating on Guam. The older Japanese uncle was very interesting. He had campaigned with the Japanese army in China during World War II. As he explained it, the Japanese were prepared for the worst after the war from the victorious Americans. They were amazed at the restraint and goodwill of the Americans during occupation. It was a fascinating conversation. After all that time on an island several miles wide by 35 miles long, I was still thrilled to leave. I can still remember looking out the window as I jetted away from the island. It was a real high. I was going home for leave to buy my first new car and knew I would be spending the last 9 months in the service at Skaggs Island, just to the north of San Francisco. The end of my service time was in sight, and I was anticipating finishing up my education at Worcester State College. In the year and a half I spent away from home, there were problems there. My mother kept it from me, but she had a complete hysterectomy, which played havoc with her hormones and moods. My father had a mental breakdown due to my family problems and because his self-esteem had taken a hit as a result of problems he was having trying to find a job that would pay him enough to live on. My sister Barbara had taken up with a Green Beret soldier out of Fort Devens. She'd always been very religious and close to my mother. On the one hand, I'm sure my sister had to deal with difficult feelings of love, loyalty, and morality. My parents were dealing as best they could with the moral issue and with a sense of propriety and protective instinct. The result was almost assured. My sister asserted herself by breaking with my parents and attaching herself to the soldier, Norman Billingsley, who was really a creep. I was unaware of a great deal at this time. I did write to my mother explaining that in the interest of maintaining a close relationship with their daughter and my sister, perhaps they should allow her to go her own way and just be supportive in areas where they could. My mother was deeply offended by my presumption, arguing that I was too far from the situation to understand. While at home, I picked up my new '72 Chevy Vega and I had ordered that cost $2,700 while I was on Guam. I picked it up in Boston and drove it home to Worcester. It took a while to get used to the standard shift, but I couldn't have been happier if it had been a Corvette. I drove across the country to my last assignment in 5 days in my new car. As I drove up the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, I had a very unsettling experience. The sky seemed to open up as the rain poured down, thunder boomed, and lightning flashed. Suddenly it began to hail. Within a few minutes, the ice began to mount on the road surface. I was scared and angry as I watched the hail bouncing off my new car. It was getting slippery and the car was having a tough time on a very steep incline. I got behind a trailer truck and shifted down to first gear. I tried not to look to the roadside because of the sheer drop off beyond the guardrails. Eventually the storm ceased to my immense relief. Driving onto the base in California, I felt like a returning high school senior, a 3-year veteran of the system and feeling quite comfortable in my position. The future looked bright and promising. The 9 months spent in California were like a vacation. San Francisco was less than a 2-hour drive, though I didn't get to the city very often. I did enjoy roaming the area north of the bay in my new Vega, driving as far as the Russian River in the north. Visiting wineries in the immense Napa Valley area was also a fun experience. I advanced in rank quickly. I became a second-class petty officer in under 2 years, about as quickly as was allowed. I could have made first class before my 4 years were up, but I didn't make the effort since I knew I'd be leaving. Several months prior to my separation date, I was called in for a re-up session, re-enlistment. The recruiter promised an extension of my assignment in California for another year if I re-upped. Even more tempting was an offer of the $10,000 re-enlistment bonus. That was 2 years' salary for 6-year commitment. By this time, I had already been accepted back to Worcester State. The thought of accepting never seriously crossed my mind. I told everyone they could have offered me $1 million and it wouldn't have made any difference. I never felt comfortable living as a member of the military with its hierarchical system and pervasive control it exercised over one's life. I wanted to determine my own fate, never being one who was comfortable under somebody else's authority. Seems to be a DiBara characteristic. On the drive back to Worcester after my discharge in August of 1971, I took a side trip to Oklahoma to visit my Aunt Marion and my cousins. They hadn't expected me, and the meeting was very much a surprise. I was only there for a few days, but spent a good deal of time with Brett and his younger sister. At that time, my aunt ran a liquor store, and the family lived on a lovely ranch. Only a few years after this meeting, Brett was accidentally shot in the stomach by a friend and died. The friend managed to carry him home, where he died in his mother's arms. His last words were that he didn't want to die. He was too young, a real tragedy. I arrived home at the end of August, only a week or so before the fall semester was to begin at Worcester State. I got a part-time job at Denholm's shoe department in the recently opened Auburn Mall. I was also getting a government check from the VA because I was on the GI Bill. Between the two incomes and the fact that I was living at home, I was comfortable enough financially. It also helped that my tuition was waived at the state school because I was a Vietnam veteran. It was there that one of the most fortunate events of my life occurred. While working in the shoe department, I noticed a cute girl working in the kiosk selling cards and gift items. She seemed nice but kind of young. I asked two girls working on the cookies counter who were sisters how old the girl was. They told me she was around 22. I couldn't believe it. I was sure she was no more than 18 or 19. I started talking with her frequently, and by mid-December, got the courage to ask her for a date, and she accepted. Janet lived in Southbridge, about 18 miles south of Worcester. The apartment she and her parents lived in was on the second floor. I walked up the front steps and nervously knocked at the door. Jan opened it, and I walked into the living room. Her mother was sitting on the couch opposite the door, and her dad was sitting in a reclining chair. Her mom looked very serious and eyed me very closely. Her dad had a great smile and immediately put me at ease with his conversational style. I liked him from the first moment. Jan and I hit it off from the first. On the first date, though, I drove her home with a sense that she didn't have all that great a time. But when we kissed in the car across the street from her home, it was very enthusiastic. I knew we'd be going out again. I thought she was a real beauty and couldn't understand why she'd want to go out with me. My hair was already beginning to thin, and I wasn't really that great looking. Though I was going to college, my major was history, not a subject area with a great employment potential. In any event, by mid-April, I had proposed to her, and we set the wedding date of July 1st. A formal proposal occurred during the dinner show, Fiddler on the Roof, at the Chateau de Ville in Framingham. I slipped the ring under the table and handed it to her. Though expecting it, she didn't realize it would be then or there. She jumped and she got all giggly. For both of us, this was at once in a lifetime event, and I've always been grateful for her answer. Hopefully Jan has been as well. While everyone is unique, Janet's qualities complement mine in a way that I had to believe is rare. I have always thought of myself as supremely fortunate to have met and married her, a wonderful accident of personal history. She has a beautiful smile and it brightens my life and has always been so very affectionate to me. As long as we've been together, she's been totally loyal and supportive. But she also possesses an introspective side. It didn't take long to notice that she was prone to drift off, zone out occasionally, becoming preoccupied with something or other. She can focus her attention in an instant. With a quick intelligence, she can capture the gist of things almost immediately. The flip side is a seeming aloofness and spaciness at times. She is independent, expressing her own opinions frankly and freely, if not always diplomatically. She is confident, yet vulnerable. A sensitive person, she often masks it under surface combativeness. Tears can come quickly, but smiles even more so. As an avid and voracious reader, she'll peruse anything that comes within her reach. She makes her book judgments quickly. If it doesn't catch her interest within a few paragraphs, she'll toss it. She's very intelligent, outscoring me in every quantitative measure used to test for college preparedness. Even when we both studied for and took the graduate record exam, she still beat me, even though I studied more intensely and diligently. But she quit UMass in her sophomore year. She says she just couldn't write papers and avoided them regardless of the cost. I think she might be affected by attention deficit disorder. She eventually got her bachelor's degree in psychology from Curry when we both worked there. It helped that we knew the professors and she was given plenty of time to complete the program, complete her final assignment. My intellectual strengths are perseverance, good spatial aptitude, always scored high on spatial tasks, broad general interest including in science, history, geography, politics, literature, despite some of my high school math grades, mathematical strength as well. I also have some ability to communicate and explain, a very modest artistic painting ability. Both of our children inherited their mother's quick intelligence and some of my obsessiveness. If, as some say, the measure of intelligence is the ability to thrive in the world, both kids rate high. To get back on track, what happened after our engagement is a blur. There were many visits to relatives as both of us were showcased to future in-laws. Wedding preparations were accelerated. In connection with the church, Jan and I had to attend special classes that were supposed to help us prepare for married life. We even had to appear one-on-one with the priest to discuss our personal feelings. We earned the stamp of approval. Everything worked out wonderfully. On the appointed day of July 1st, 1972, a lovely one, we were married at St. Mary's in Southbridge. Jan looked absolutely stunning in her flowing white gown, long black, I call it, she calls it dark brown, hair. After she had completed her walk down the aisle, she placed her cool, perspiring hand into mine. I had a hard time believing I was really there. The reception at Rom's Restaurant in Southbridge, a landmark and a setting for so many family events, happy and sad. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. Most of the relatives from both families attended. It was perhaps one of the final family get-togethers for some of my relatives, but we have only the fondest memories of that whole day. After the reception, we headed out on our honeymoon. We got as far as Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where we stopped at a motel just off the highway. I remember we enjoyed a delicious steak dinner there. The next day, we traveled to Bar Harbor in Maine, where I was stationed, actually, not too far away. We were booked for the Wonderview Motel, a few miles out of town and close to the embarkation point of the Blue Nose ferry that made regular crossings to Nova Scotia. From there, we set out en route to Quebec that took us into the backwoods of rural Maine. This was a very interesting part of the trip. There were no highways, just many miles of secondary roads more used to logging trucks than automobiles. Evidence of logging was abundant. We passed by rivers and lakes filled with floating logs. We crossed into Canada, Janet's first trip out of the country. We had hoped to be able to stay at the Chateau de Ville in the heart of the old town. Either it was booked or too expensive. We ended up at a hotel not too far from the center of Old Town. Janet was displeased with our accommodations, so much so that she started sobbing. I think it was more of a release from all the stress, strangeness, and excitement of the previous week. We did get into a bit of a spat when we began our tour of the city, where the difference in personalities clashed a little bit here. While I wanted to do it in a methodical way to get my bearings, spatial relations, Jan wanted to jump right into it and go wherever her interest took her. We ended up doing it her way. Thus began the process of learning about one another as a married couple. We had a great time in Quebec. There was a lot of walking, but we also took a horse and carriage ride as befit the occasion. I was fascinated by the Plains of Abraham, where Wolfe and Montcalm fought the critical battle that decided the fate of this Canadian province. The chateau was magnificent, and we had several meals there, breakfast among them. During one breakfast, I wanted some prune juice, and I went to get some from the buffet table. I walked back to my seat and began to take a sip. It turned out to be molasses. After our honeymoon, we moved into our first home together on East Mountain Street in Worcester, only a few miles from my grandmother's home on Lincoln Street. Jan was working as a pharmacy technician at St. Vincent's. I put in another year at Worcester State and graduated in May of 1973. Upon graduation, it was time to find a job. For a time, I worked with my father at a Shell gas station close by the old Union Station at Lincoln Square. That didn't turn out very well. I lacked the mechanical skills needed to contribute much to the repair part of the business, but all I could do was pump gas, grease cars, and change oil. After a few months, my father ended that business, and I began working for New England Telephone as one of the very first male service reps in Worcester. This was at a time when the phone company, when it was one monolithic entity before it was broken up. It wasn't a great job, but the salary wasn't bad. The office was on the ground level of the Bancroft building in downtown Worcester. The dunning calls on overdue bills were hard for me, as it was the responsibility for disconnecting people for non-payment. Like many jobs I had, though, I tried to make something of a game out of it. It was during this period when our daughter Jennifer was born, in October 1973. Janet began to feel contractions during the night. We headed to the hospital together. This was at a time when hospitals were beginning to allow fathers to attend the delivery. During labor, I was with Janet as the contractions became more frequent and the discomfort more pronounced. At one point, Jan said she wasn't going to stay there any longer and wanted to go home. I was dumbfounded at her state of mind. She wasn't entirely herself. Actually, she was. Finally, they gave her a painkiller and that settled her down. We headed to the delivery room where I saw my daughter being born. I wasn't allowed to stand next to Janet, as fathers may do now, but I could see the birth as that little head popped out. I was very concerned when I saw that the umbilical cord was wrapped around her little neck a couple of times, but the doctor was totally calm and said there was nothing to worry about. Color was good. This was the closest thing to a miracle I've ever experienced. An entirely new and unique person was created, and their existence was a manifestation of our love. I was her father. We decided not to call anyone before the birth. All the calls were made afterward. This was the first great-grandchild for Vic and Adelgie Costanzi, and so it was quite an event in Southbridge. It was a very exciting time for Janet and I. We moved from our apartment on East Mountain Street to Pilgrim Ave. Our new place was considerably older. It was on the third floor of an old three-decker tenement. There was no central heat and only a gas stove in the living room. Though there were storm windows, the cold air blew through open cracks in the frames during the winter. One of the few redeeming features was the rent, which was $90 a month, substantially less than the $150 we were paying. The son of our landlord, who lived on the first floor, was killed in a motorcycle accident. That caused the whole family, I believe the name was Fayard, who rode motorcycles. They suddenly quit and stopped riding motorcycles altogether. At work, I got along well enough with the girls in the unit, but my female supervisor, Joan Deasy, was another matter. She got a very bad reputation for verbal abuse during annual evaluations. Many girls were said to leave their interviews in tears. I felt confident in my performance and saw little reason to be apprehensive. During the interview, the supervisor complained that, according to monitoring record from another supervisor, I had been rude to a customer. I responded that she knew me better than that. This was pure fabrication on her part. Then she said that the girls in my unit complained about my personal hygiene, that I smelled bad. I couldn't believe my ears. This woman was very strange indeed. It was as though she wanted to see how much it took to get her interviewee upset. Within a few weeks, I told her I'd be quitting and asked her to set up an interview with the manager. That interview brought some personal satisfaction. He called her on the carpet for having a bad attitude. She maintained her composure but didn't offer any defense. He offered to move me to another office, but I said I wasn't really happy there anyway. After leaving Bell, I got a job with my father's former employer, Millbrook Distributors. I drove a van filled with various non-food grocery store items, like kitchen utensils, fabric, dye, rat poison, and so on. It was my job to stock these items at various stores in Worcester County and a few places in Connecticut. There was much driving involved. I did like the independence afforded by the job, but there was a degree of manipulation going on. My pay was supposed to be based on a percentage of what I delivered. There was a base pay that was referred to as a draw. Theoretically, if the commission sales exceeded the draw, the additional amount would be paid as a bonus. Practically, the routes were managed so that lucrative routes went to whomever supervisors felt like rewarding. The commission rate was also set up in a way that kept the drivers fairly low paid. I never made much over the draw. My father, who was far more personable than I and who worked longer for the company, did really well. To give him his due, he was also very conscientious and a hard worker. He did so well on commission that the company reduced his percentage. He was making more in commissions than his salary. Around the time I graduated from college, I took the civil service exam, and I got a good score. That, coupled with my degree and extra points for being a veteran, resulted in a job offer for employment with the Social Security Administration. When I was officially offered my job, I immediately resigned from Millbrook. They tried to convince me to stay. I had all I could do to keep from laughing in their faces. This was an opportunity to work in government and earn some pretty decent money within a few short years. For someone with a new family, this was the answer to a prayer. There was about a month of training in Providence. The agency put members of my class in a hotel. I traveled home during the weekends. The training was intensive and comprehensive. We were responsible for knowing the law as set out as a claims manual that spanned many volumes. Placed side by side, binding to binding, the whole set would probably extend 8 or 9 feet. In addition, we were responsible for keeping up to date with constant stream of transmittals that modified and expanded upon what was in the manual. Had I known the extent of what I would be responsible for at the time the position was being offered, I may very well have turned it down and waited for something else. The status itself was attractive. After a few years, I could reach GS10 level. The salary was very good, escalating quickly during the first 4 years. As a claims adjudicator, I would be responsible and was responsible for evaluating people's eligibility for certain benefits. As an interviewer and adjudicator, I would get to interact with and hopefully help people. The job involved utilizing many skills and abilities. There were great health benefits and retirement plan. Upon my assignment to the Fitchburg office, my family of 3 moved into an apartment in Gardner, some 12 miles west. This was a time of great expansion in the Social Security Administration. The federal government had assumed the responsibility for many state aid programs in the area of aged and disabled. There was a new federal program called SSI, or Supplemental Security Income. I was in the vanguard of the new hires to help administer the new program. In February of 1975, I experienced a second miracle, no less amazing than the first, with the birth of our second and final child, Paul Jr. We already had a lovely, feisty little girl, and both of us were anticipating what this little one would be. As this new baby was entering the world, I remember commenting on the thick black hair and how this one was going to be a real Italian. Then the announcement, it was a boy. This was most exciting news in Southbridge. The Costanzi family had produced a string of girls in the previous generation, and after Jennifer, expected the trend to continue. When Janet's grandfather, Nono, was told about the brand new baby boy, all he could say was, "Thank you, thank you." Now we had one of each. It felt wonderful. Baby Paul had to stay in the hospital under the lights for several days because of jaundice. Not too long after, we brought Paul Jr. back to Gardner. Jennifer experienced a convulsion, kind of reminding me of my sister Diane. Louise and Vic were with Jan and the kids in our Gardner apartment. Jan was supposed to be bringing Paul to Worcester for a checkup. The usually perpetual motion machine that was Jennifer suddenly became non-responsive. She just stared into space and could not be roused. Louise was terrified that she would end up like her own cousin Laura, who'd gotten ill as an infant and suffered serious retardation as a result. Vic carried Jennifer while Janet drove. New to the area, Janet wasn't sure where to go, so they just followed the hospital signs till they reached Henry Hayward Hospital. Jennifer's condition appeared to have been triggered by a rapid increase in temperature, which the body couldn't adjust to fast enough. In any event, she was just fine and returned to her scampering ways in short order. While we were living at an apartment on Dinan Drive in Gardner, there was a fire in the unit next to ours. We heard the alarms and the smoke filled the hallway. We evacuated our unit and I went back to be sure there was no one left in the burning apartment. I stayed close to the floor as I approached the apartment. The door was closed and I called out, but there was no answer. I reached up to the door handle and opened it. When I did, the flames shot out into the hall, which would have been right in my face if I had been standing. I quickly scanned what I could see from the position I was in, and when I couldn't see or hear anyone immediately, it was probably not the smartest thing to do, but it was more of a reaction than a reason to act. The fire in the unit was extinguished by the fire department, but even with our door closed, a good deal of smoke made it into our unit, and it took a while to clean up. Our next milestone was the purchase of our first house. It was an almost new ranch house in Templeton. The original owners had lived there only a few years. The purchase price of the house was $24,000. It came on a half-acre lot. Now we were the picture of a middle-class family. About this time, Social Security opened a new branch office in Gardner. I was one of the 2 claims reps who opened the corner store office. My work commute was cut to 10 minutes. One night, as I was wandering on the lawn outside, thinking about how my life was proceeding, I had an almost euphoric experience. I looked up into the sky and said a thank you to whoever might be listening. I just felt grateful and wanted to express my appreciation to the universe. In 1976, Paul Jr. fell off his hobby horse and suffered a gash around his eye that required 4 stitches. He also ended up with a black eye. There were a couple of pictures of him with a black right eye. Jennifer had 2 accidents during the time at Templeton. While playing in her room, she fell and grabbed at the metal folding door of her closet. Her fingers got caught in one of the horizontal slats and was sliced very deeply. One in particular, we took her to the hospital where the injury was stitched. We were planning to go on vacation and were told there was no need to change our plan as long as we were careful to keep the injury clean. Somehow, though, the cut got infected and she ended up with a scar that she's always carried. Another time, Jennifer was playing with her brother and some neighborhood friends. As they were playing, she was pushed by her brother and fell down, breaking her left arm. She was a trooper, though, and managed to put up with a cast for several weeks. Another anecdote that I enjoy relating also involved Jennifer. I was standing on a ladder as I worked to construct a storage shed in the backyard. I was hammering nails when a little Jen called her daddy. In the middle of a swing, that momentary distraction was enough to cause the flying metal head to come down on my thumb. I've never felt a pain so intensely for so long. Unable to sleep that night, I got out of bed and went to the kitchen where I found a sewing needle. In an attempt to relieve the pressure and the pain, I worked to poke a little hole through my fingernail. After a time, the fingernail was finally breached and the blood pushed out. It did help with the pain. Paul Jr. had his moments as well. Even as an infant, Paul was very good-natured. That quality was put to the test, however, when we realized that his little legs were more bowed than they should have been. The orthopedic doctor prescribed a metal brace for him to wear at night. We were told that if this didn't work, he'd have to have his legs broken and reset later in life. Jan and I felt awful putting that brace on him when it was bedtime. The little guy managed to kick out of the device. We would tie his little feet as tight as possible, short of cutting off circulation. But when we would enter his room in the morning, the brace was far away from his feet. After a while, it was impossible to keep things on him. We had to stop and hope for the best. We didn't have any difficulty potty training Paul. He converted from diapers quickly. He had a more difficult time remembering where to go. On one occasion, Jennifer was ill and we were just using a vaporizer to relieve her congestion. We went in to check on her and noticed a terrible odor in the room. He had relieved himself in the vaporizer. The pressures of my job were intense and were starting to take a toll over time. We manufacture our own pressures. It's all in our perception and reaction. This is easy to say, not so easy really to believe or act upon. Added to my basic insecurity was the volume of work and the various responsibilities of the job as husband and father. It became virtually impossible for me to relax. Even off the job, I was always worrying about my workload and my performance. One day in the spring of '76, our office was visited by a traveling medical van. The government was providing for free checkups. It included an EKG. At the time of the checkup, I was given a clean bill of health. The very next day, I was sitting in the break room having a coffee when one of my coworkers remarked that I looked pale. At some point, I checked my pulse and noticed it was racing. So I took some sick time and went home. The next day, I went to the Fallon Clinic in Worcester where they took another battery of tests. They found nothing. Everything checked out normal. They told me to go to the nearest hospital if it happened again. The second episode happened at work. This time I went to Henry Haywood Hospital in Gardner, where they captured the arrhythmia on an EKG in the emergency room. The rate reached 250 beats per minute, but it converted in about 20 to 30 minutes. Then in July of '79, I was playing softball game with some other folks from the office when something a good deal more scary happened. I was in the outfield running after a fly ball when suddenly I felt lightheaded and out of breath. My pulse was racing. I took Paul Jr., who was at the ball field with me, and headed home. When I got home, I jumped into a cold shower to try to shock my system back to normal rhythm, but that didn't work. I was getting more upset because I couldn't catch my breath. Gianna had to drive me to the hospital because I wasn't sure I'd make it at all on my own without passing out. In a few minutes it took to get there, I was having an increasingly difficult time. Unable to get out of the car, the hospital personnel had to wheel me in. Upon entering the emergency room, I was placed on a gurney and an IV put into my arm. I requested oxygen to help me breathe. That brought some relief, but my heart was racing at over 280 beats a minute. I heard one of the doctors ask another if he would like to see a great example of tachycardia. They came over to me and asked how I felt. It had been several minutes since the last injection, but the rate hadn't converted back to normal. The doctor told me that if it didn't change within a few minutes, they would have to digitize me, which meant the paddles. He said not to worry because they would administer a sedative to put me out. All I could think of was the possibility that I'd be closing my eyes for the last time. As I watched the heart monitor, the readout suddenly and unexpectedly dropped back to normal, 80 beats a minute. It was as though a huge weight was lifted off my chest. Though everything seemed to be back to normal, they weren't about to let me go home. I spent a total of a week there, almost all of it in the intensive care unit. During my stay there, my dad came to visit me, but my mother never did. He said she didn't like the hospitals. I say that, but then I also think, what mother would not overcome her fear of hospitals or anxiety about hospitals to see her son in the emergency room? Now, I mean, as a child, my mother was great, but there were some things that, to me, were almost inexcusable and unexplainable. This was one of them. For all the tests conducted on me, the doctors were never able to explain the cause. The best explanation provided was that of an electrical short somewhere in the heart's electrical system. They recommended I cut down on caffeine, and I cut out caffeine, prescribed some beta blocker medication. They still don't have a way of dealing with this any more effective than the medication I was taking. I'm still taking medication for that condition. I guess the only thing, even then, they could use as a treatment was invasive. If they could identify where in the heart that short in the electrical system was occurring, they could go in and burn that area. And that thought never really appealed to me that much. After that episode, I began to think the job stress was getting to be too much. In discussing the situation with Jan, we decided that I would apply to enter Worcester State College Master's in Education program with a concentration in history. I still had 2 years left on my VA educational benefits. We sold the house in Templeton and purchased another in Worcester on Butler Street, only a block away from my former grammar school of Quinsigamon. Janet returned to the pharmacy at St. V's, just a couple of miles from our new home. It was back to Worcester State College for me. The only expense my schooling was some minor fees. I had a tuition waiver this time as well. Between the VA checks and Janet's salary, we did fine. The house had more living area than the place in Templeton. There was a garage under our bedroom, a finished room downstairs we used as Paul's bedroom. There was a stairway leading to this enviably spacious room. Jennifer began attending my old grammar school, even had the same second or third grade teacher. We placed Paul Jr. in a nursery school a couple of blocks from home. He told me not too long ago that he still remember the day his class came to our house. I had painted a large smiley face on the front of the house. I was in the process of repainting the whole house. The Worcester school system was very good for Jennifer. She benefited from the city's gifted program. It allowed her to engage in extracurricular activities like trips to Sturbridge Village. Paul Jr. was assessed by one Catholic preschool that indicated he was gifted as well. There was another episode of Paul in the toilet. Jen and I were sitting in the living room one evening when Paul walked up the stairs from his bedroom, only half awake. He tried the door to the bathroom but couldn't get in, so he just sprayed the door. I jumped up and went to him, not scolding him, but opening the door and guiding him to the toilet. I had a lot of extra time on my hands and decided to bring some extra money in to the household. I got a part-time job at a D'Angelo's sub shop at the start of Butler Street. For several months I worked there, hand mixing tuna salad and making subs at lunchtime. It wasn't a job I'm particularly proud of, but it was convenient. Upon receiving my master's degree and teacher's certification, I was back in the job market. There was no luck trying to get a teaching position in the area. I decided to take another chance with Social Security. The hope was that I would be able to work into a position in the training division of the agency.